Hi, today we're going to talk about this lens. This is the 56mm f1.2 APD lens from Fujifilm. This is the second 56mm f1.2 lens from the company. And what is interesting about this lens is the APD, or apodization filter. So let's start by looking at what the apodization filter does and what it means. Okay, so let's talk about the apodization filter on the 56mm Fujifilm f1.2. Now, first of all, what you need to know is this is not the first lens in the world to have a built-in apodization filter. There were a few other lenses with an apodization filter in the past, but they were all manual. This is an autofocus capable lens. So this is the first autofocus capable lens with a built-in apodization filter. Now, what does an apodization filter do? Well, basically what it does is makes the bokeh of the lens more smoother, more creamier. It gives them a more creamier look. This is just a definition, but this is how it works, and it's not a very substantial difference. If you look at the images from this lens and the regular f1.2 56mm from Fujifilm, the difference will not be very dramatic. So don't expect any dramatic changes. This is very subtle, if you like. So this is in terms of what it does, but how it works. Well, online you can find a few definitions. Something that we have found somewhere explains the working of this in this way. The apodization element is simply a radial natural density filter that gets darker towards the edges of the image, of the frame, placed near the aperture stop of the lens. So not in the front. This causes each disk of light to fade out gradually towards the edges. This helps the individual disk to blend together to produce a much more smoother bokeh that we've mentioned previously. The blur you get is effectively the same as running a Gaussian blur over the image. Now, you can get theoretically a similar effect by placing a apodization filter in the front, but you will get a lot of vignetting for the image, and this is why Fujifilm added the apodization filter near the aperture of the lens. So this is in terms of how it actually works, more or less. Now, what are the advantages? We've mentioned them. It improves the bokeh, it makes it more smoother, creamier, etc. But not by much. What are the disadvantages? Well, there are at least three. The first is the reduced amount of light which reaches your sensor basically through the lens. This is actually mentioned on the lens itself. So if you look at the aperture ring here on the bottom, you see f1.2 in white, and below it you can see f1.7. So above is the light which the f-stop basically. And below you see the actual the t-stop, I think, or the actual light that reaches the sensor. So when you're shooting at f1.2, you might get the blurring of the background, which is equivalent to what you get in the let's say the other 56mm f1.2 lens, but the amount of light which actually reaches the sensor is only f1.7. So this is quite a big difference in terms of light gathering. When you're in f1.4, it's like f1.8. At f2, it's like f2.3. At f2.8, it's like f3. At f4, it's f4.2. And at f5.6, it's identical. It's f5.6. So this is in terms of light gathering capabilities, which, as we have seen, it's decreased when using the apodization filter. Obviously, you can turn it off. It's always working on this lens. So reduced amount of light is one thing. Now the second thing is a slower autofocus. Now the reason for that is very clear. Because you have this apodization filter, less light reaches the sensor, and because of this, and maybe for other reasons as well, the camera, or at least some of the Fujifilm cameras which use phase detect autofocus, can't use the phase detect autofocus on this lens, or with this lens. So what this means is that they are reduced to using only the contrast-based autofocus capabilities of the camera, and this reduces the effectiveness. Now, in regular light, this is usually not a problem, but in low light situation, this is a problem, and we will mention this later on in the video. But basically, what you will see is that what we have seen is that we shot a wedding with this, and we lost a lot of images because the autofocus was hunting and wasn't able to actually point. The autofocus basically didn't work in some situations, or didn't work well. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. If you're shooting it in good light situation, then you don't have a problem. But if you're shooting at low light situation a lot, keep that in mind. Now, the third thing is obviously price. We will talk about pricing in the conclusion, but basically this is significantly more expensive than the regular F1.2 56mm lens from Fujifilm. So, you know, when thinking about buying this, you know, versus the other lens, you have to realize that this is a very specialized lens, which is meant for very discerning, let's call them this, photographers who really are really interested in the way the bokeh looks. So from here on, let's look at the design of the 56mm APD Fujifilm lens. So let's look at the XF56mm f1.2 APD lens from Fujifilm. Now, as you can see, it's not a very large lens. It has two rings. This is the focus ring, very, very smooth, very nice to use. And the second ring is the aperture ring, which moves in clicks, as you can see, from f1.2 and up to f16, and here you have the aperture mode. On the bottom you have the writing 56mm APD, which is the type of the lens. Now, if we look at the top of the lens we have on the front, we have a very large front element, at least for a 50 or 50-ish millimeter lens. This is a 62mm filter thread, so pretty large. Again, very well made lens, solid construction, very nice focus ring, just like all the other XF lenses from Fujifilm. So let's talk about the performance of this lens. Well, we were very, very pleased with how this lens performed. First of all, the image was very, very sharp, even wide open. We looked at the vignetting, and as you can see maybe on the screen right now, we don't get a lot of vignetting. Barrel distortion wasn't a problem. Shooting into a light was also not a problem. But in terms of the actual sharpness, and again, this is what we were mostly interested in, this lens performs superbly. Now, the bigger question that a lot of you are probably asking is how the bokeh looks. Well, to be honest, we're not the most discerning people when it comes to bokeh, so we'll let you judge. We did test the 56mm f1.2 non-APD version, but the problem with that lens was that it was a pre-production model and it had some issues. So we didn't have a chance to do a side-by-side comparison, but we did look at some images online from other people who did do a side-by-side comparison, and to be honest, the differences look very small. It really boils down to how discerning you are when it comes to the bokeh. If you're really looking at how smooth it is, and if you can actually figure out the differences. Again, we didn't see many of them. In some images, maybe wide open, but otherwise not a lot of differences. But again, the image performance of this lens is really superb. So let's go to the conclusion and see what we think in general about the lens, its performance, and obviously its value. So we had to return the lens before we had a chance to shoot the conclusion, so we are going to do this quickly over B-roll. Let's start with the advantages of this lens. It has amazing sharpness in the center of the frame. If you close down to about f2.8 or f4, you also get very good sharpness in the corners. The build quality is superb, just like all the rest of the XF lenses from Fujifilm. It has improved bokeh, but really ever so slightly. We will include a link in the written review to see some side-by-side comparisons. Now, in terms of disadvantages, well, there are a few. First of all, you do lose some light, especially until f5.6. The autofocus is slower, especially in lower light situations, as we have seen when we shot a wedding. You do see some vignetting, contrary to what we have said before, especially in RAW. In JPEG, you don't see this because the camera actually corrects it. Now, in terms of pricing, this is about $300 more expensive than the non-APD version. So it really boils down to whether or not you actually see the difference in the bokeh. We actually couldn't see it that much. And if you can live with the reduced light and slower autofocus and the vignetting, you can go for this lens. Otherwise, we would recommend going for the non-APD version, which is an amazing lens. You can, of course, subscribe to our channel to see other reviews and read the full review with all the comparisons on lensvid.com.